March 1888. The Great Blizzard slams the Hudson River Valley with 45-mile-per-hour winds and drifts reaching 50 feet. By midnight, water jugs freeze solid inside frontier cabins. Breath fogs 3 feet from the fire. But in one cabin, something strange catches the eye. A wooden cabinet against the wall with sliding doors and carved spindles for air. Neighbors call it the Coffin. Inside, a Franco-Acadian lumberman and his wife sleep warm enough to sweat. The room temperature drops to 28 degrees. Inside their enclosed bed, 58 to 62 degrees, 30 degrees warmer with the doors shut. This wasn't some newfangled invention. The Lit-clos, or box bed, had warmed Breton and Scottish families for centuries, but frontier wisdom demanded open bedsteads and roaring stoves all night long. They called his cabinet bed unhealthy, said it would trap bad air, mocked it as foreign foolishness that looked like a coffin. While his neighbors burned 3 armloads of wood per night to keep from freezing, his banked stove needed only 1 load. His enclosed bed cut night fuel use by 50%. When the blizzard finally passed, children in open rooms suffered chilblains and coughs. His family stayed healthy. What did this Acadian carpenter understand about human heat, air volume, and thermal barriers that everyone else missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The March wind cut across the Hudson Valley like a blade, carrying with it the promise of the worst storm in recorded memory. Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau could feel it in his bones as he checked the sliding doors on the wooden cabinet that dominated one corner of his single-room cabin. His neighbors had been calling it the Coffin since he'd finished building it the previous autumn, but tonight their mockery would be put to the test. Thibodeau had grown up in the Acadian settlements of Nova Scotia, where winter meant survival, and survival meant understanding heat. His grandfather had slept in a Lit-clos, a box bed, carved from pine and fitted with doors that sealed out the killing drafts. The old man had taught him that a smart man heats the person, not the room. But here in the American frontier, such wisdom was dismissed as foreign foolishness. The storm arrived just after sunset on March 11, 1888. By 9 o'clock, the wind was howling at 45 miles per hour, driving snow horizontal across the valley. Drifts began piling against cabin walls, sealing doors and covering windows. The temperature dropped to 6 degrees in New York City, and here in the mountains it would go lower still. Samuel Morrison, the English-born storekeeper who served as road overseer, had spent the afternoon warning anyone who would listen about the dangers of enclosed sleeping. "Mark my words," he'd told the gathering at Henley's Mill, "that contraption will be the death of them. A man needs fresh air, not some foreign coffin trapping his breath." Morrison's own frame house boasted 2 proper bedsteads with heavy quilts and a cast-iron stove that could heat the main room to 70 degrees when stoked hard. But as midnight approached, Morrison found himself throwing split oak into his firebox every hour. The wind found every gap in his walls, every loose board, every poorly chinked joint. His breath fogged when he stepped away from the stove. Ice began forming on the water bucket beside his bed. 3 miles up the valley, Thibodeau banked his fire with practiced efficiency. He'd learned the technique from Alain Rousseau, a Breton joiner who'd emigrated to the lumber camps 20 years earlier. Rousseau had taught him that the Lit-clos worked on simple principles. Human bodies generate about 100 watts of heat at rest, and in a small enclosed space, that heat accumulates rather than dissipating into a drafty room. Thibodeau's box bed measured 66 inches long, 48 inches wide, and 48 inches high. The interior volume was roughly 90 cubic feet, small enough that 2 adults could warm it with their body heat alone. The cabinet sat on 8-inch legs to avoid dampness from the earth floor, and its tongue-and-groove pine panels sealed tight, except for 2 carefully positioned vents, a low intake near the foot and a high outlet near the head, both fitted with wooden sliders that could be adjusted for airflow. The doors themselves were the masterpiece. Thibodeau had carved them with spindled galleries, decorative openings that allowed controlled ventilation while maintaining the thermal barrier. A heavy curtain hung inside the doors, creating a double seal that his Scottish mentor, Duncan MacLeod, had insisted upon. McLeod had worked the Maine border cruise and knew the value of layered protection against night drafts. As the storm intensified, Thibodeau and his wife Marie climbed into their enclosed bed and slid the doors shut. The difference was immediate. While the main room temperature plummeted toward freezing, the space inside their cabinet remained comfortable. The small thermometer Thibodeau had hung from the interior wall showed 58 degrees, then climbed to 62 as their combined body heat warmed the trapped air. Outside the box bed, ice formed on the cabin's single window. The water jug beside the cold stove developed a skin of ice. Pipe smoke from Thibodeau's last draw before sleep hung motionless in the frigid air. But inside the Lit-clos, husband and wife slept in shirt sleeves, occasionally pushing aside their wool blanket when they grew too warm. Morrison's house told a different story. Despite burning through 3 armloads of split oak, his main room never rose above 35 degrees. He and his wife huddled under every quilt they owned, waking hourly to feed the fire. Their breath clouded the air above their open bedstead. Frost formed on the interior walls. By dawn, they'd consumed nearly a quarter cord of wood and still felt the bite of winter through their heaviest coverings. The storm raged for 3 days. When it finally passed, the landscape had been transformed. Drifts reached 40 feet in places, burying fences and trapping families in their homes. But the real revelation came when neighbors began comparing their experiences. Those with open bedsteads had burned enormous quantities of fuel just to survive. Many reported frozen water buckets, ice-covered walls, and children who woke coughing from the cold drafts that found every gap in their defenses. Thibodeau's fuel consumption told a different story. His banked fire had required only 1 armload per night, roughly half what his neighbors had burned. The enclosed bed had created its own microclimate, a pocket of warmth that his body heat alone could maintain. Marie had slept soundly, never once needing to tend the fire or add another blanket. Word spread quickly through the valley. The Coffin, that had drawn so much ridicule, had proven itself when conventional frontier wisdom failed. Families who had mocked the foreign contraption now asked quiet questions about its construction. The enclosed bed that had looked like a death trap had kept its occupants comfortable while their neighbors fought for survival. Morrison himself appeared at Thibodeau's door on the 4th day after the storm, his usual confidence replaced by grudging curiosity. The evidence was undeniable. The Acadian's strange sleeping cabinet had outperformed every open bedstead in the valley. The morning after Morrison's visit, Thibodeau found himself surrounded by skeptical neighbors who wanted to understand how a wooden box could outperform their time-tested methods. He led them to the cabinet bed and opened the sliding doors, revealing an interior that defied their assumptions about frontier sleeping arrangements. The space looked cramped to eyes accustomed to open bedsteads, but Thibodeau knew that cramped meant warm. The principle was simple enough that any lumberman could grasp it. Heat the smallest space possible and let physics do the work. A human body at rest generates roughly 100 watts of heat, about the same as a bright oil lamp. 2 adults produce twice that amount. In a typical one-room cabin measuring 16 by 20 feet with 8-foot ceilings, those 200 watts disappear into 2,500 cubic feet of air, diluted further by drafts through gaps in the chinking and around poorly fitted doors and windows. But inside Thibodeau's box bed, that same heat warmed only 90 cubic feet of air, less than 4% of the room's volume. The tongue and groove pine panels created an effective seal, and the controlled ventilation system prevented the air from going stale while maintaining the thermal barrier. The result was a steady-state temperature differential of 30 degrees or more between the enclosed bed and the surrounding room. Thibodeau had learned the construction techniques from Alain Rousseau during 3 winters in the lumber camps. Rousseau had grown up in Finistère, where every farmhouse contained at least 1 Lit-clos built into the wall or standing free like a massive piece of furniture. The Breton joiner had insisted that the dimensions mattered. Too large and body heat couldn't warm the space effectively. Too small, and the occupants would feel trapped. The footprint Thibodeau had chosen, 66 inches long by 48 inches wide, accommodated 2 adults without crowding while keeping the internal volume low enough for efficient heating. The 48-inch height provided adequate headroom for sitting up while preventing the warm air from stratifying too far above the occupants. The entire structure sat on 8-inch legs, lifting it above the damp earth floor and creating an insulating air gap beneath. The framing consisted of 2x2 pine posts joined with simple mortise and tenon joints, then reinforced with wooden pegs. Thibodeau had milled the lumber himself at Henley's sawmill, selecting clear pine boards free from knots that might create air leaks. The panels were 1-inch tongue and groove planks fitted tight enough to eliminate drafts, but not so tight that seasonal movement would cause splitting. The ventilation system represented the most critical aspect of the design. Without controlled airflow, the enclosed space would indeed become unhealthy, trapping stale air and moisture from breathing. Thibodeau had positioned 2 vents according to Rousseau's specifications, a low intake near the foot of the bed and a high outlet near the head. Each opening measured 1 1/4 inches in diameter, large enough to provide fresh air but small enough to maintain the thermal barrier. The physics behind the ventilation relied on natural convection. Cool air entered through the low vent, warmed as it circulated around the occupants, then rose to exit through the high vent. The temperature differential created a gentle but constant air exchange that prevented staleness without destroying the heat retention. Wooden sliders allowed the occupants to adjust the airflow based on outside temperature and personal comfort. Duncan MacLeod had added his own refinements during a visit the previous summer. The Scottish housewright had worked on similar box beds in Perthshire cottages and understood the value of multiple barriers. He'd helped Thibodeau install sliding tracks for the doors, using hand-forged iron hardware that moved smoothly even in winter when wood contracted and metal grew brittle. MacLeod had also insisted on the interior curtain system. Heavy wool fabric hung from a simple rod just inside the doors, creating a double seal that trapped an additional layer of still air. The curtain could be drawn aside for easy access or pulled closed for maximum warmth retention. During the coldest nights, this inner barrier made the difference between comfort and mere survival. The doors themselves showcased Thibodeau's skills as a Finnish carpenter. Each panel featured spindled galleries carved from solid pine, decorative openings that served a practical purpose. The spindles created controlled ventilation points that allowed air exchange even when the doors were fully closed. The pattern was based on Breton examples Rousseau had sketched from memory, but Thibodeau had adapted the spacing and size to suit frontier lumber dimensions. A neighbor named Willem van der Berg recognized the design immediately. His family had maintained a traditional Dutch bedstead in their Hudson Valley farmhouse for 3 generations, built into an alcove near the kitchen hearth. The bedstead used similar principles: enclosed sleeping space, controlled ventilation, and raised platform, though the Dutch version typically featured built-in storage beneath the sleeping area. Van der Berg confirmed what Thibodeau had observed. Enclosed beds cut fuel consumption dramatically during sleeping hours. His family's bedstead allowed them to bank their fire at bedtime and still wake to comfortable temperatures, while neighbors with open bedsteads kept their stoves burning hard all night long. The fuel savings over a typical winter amounted to several cords of wood, a significant economy on the frontier where every stick had to be cut by hand. The mathematics supported the empirical evidence. If drafts created 3 air changes per hour in the enclosed bed, a reasonable estimate given the controlled vents, then the heat loss from air infiltration would equal roughly 2 4/10 times the temperature differential measured in watts. With 2 adults generating 200 watts of body heat, the system could maintain a 40-degree temperature difference at steady state. Even accounting for some heat loss through conduction to the surrounding room, a 30-degree differential was entirely achievable. Thibodeau finished his explanation by opening the small wooden box where he kept his building notes. The measurements, lumber calculations, and assembly sequence were all recorded in careful script, ready to be copied by anyone willing to invest the time and materials. The coffin that had drawn such ridicule was simply good engineering applied to an old problem: how to sleep warm when firewood is precious and winter nights are long. The barometric pressure began dropping on March 10, 1888, and experienced woodsmen could feel the change in their joints. Thibodeau checked his firewood supply one final time. 3 full cords split and stacked under cover, enough to last most families through a normal winter. But the signs in the sky suggested this would be no ordinary storm. By evening on March 11th, the wind had shifted to the northeast and picked up velocity. The first snowflakes arrived just after sunset, fat and heavy, clinging to everything they touched. Within an hour, the snow had turned to driving pellets that stung the face and built up faster than any storm Thibodeau had seen in 20 years on the frontier. The Great Blizzard of 1888 was beginning its assault on the northeastern United States. Samuel Morrison stood at his window, watching the snow accumulate with growing unease. His frame house was solid enough, built to standard specifications with proper foundation stones and tight board and batten siding. The cast-iron stove in his main room could heat the space to 70 degrees on a calm night, and he'd laid in 4 cords of seasoned oak to see his family through until spring. But as the wind velocity increased, he could feel cold drafts finding their way through gaps he'd never noticed before. By midnight, the storm had reached full fury. Wind speeds exceeded 45 miles per hour, driving snow horizontal across the valley and piling it into massive drifts against any vertical surface. The temperature in New York City had dropped to 6 degrees, and here in the mountain valleys, it was falling toward 0. Morrison found himself stoking his fire every hour, burning through split oak at twice his normal rate just to keep the main room habitable. 3 miles away, Thibodeau made his final preparations for what he knew would be a long siege. He banked his fire carefully, arranging the coals to provide steady heat for 6 to 8 hours without active tending. Unlike his neighbors who would fight the storm with brute force, burning wood as fast as they could split it, he planned to let his enclosed bed do most of the work. The widow Sarah McKinnon faced the storm with particular anxiety. Her husband had died the previous autumn, leaving her to manage their single-room cabin with 2 young children and a limited supply of firewood. She'd stretched her woodpile by burning anything that would catch: old fence posts, broken furniture, even corn cobs when nothing else remained. Her open bedstead left the children exposed to every draft that crept through the chinking, and she'd spent many nights adding layers of quilts while the fire burned low. As the storm intensified, the differences between heating strategies became stark. Morrison's house consumed enormous quantities of fuel as the wind drove cold air through every imperfection in his construction. His bedroom remained barely habitable despite the roaring stove in the adjacent room, and he found himself piling on additional blankets while still feeling the bite of cold through multiple layers of wool. Dr. Margaret Henley, the township's midwife, had spent enough winter nights making emergency calls to understand the brutal mathematics of frontier heating. She knew that children and new mothers were most vulnerable to the cold, their bodies less able to generate the heat needed to survive in drafty rooms. Her medical bag contained a small thermometer, and she'd recorded interior temperatures as low as 25 degrees in cabins where families thought they were adequately heated. By the second day of the storm, the wind had built drifts to 20 feet in the valleys and 40 feet against north-facing walls. Many cabins were completely buried, their occupants trapped inside with whatever fuel they'd managed to stockpile. Chimneys disappeared under snow, forcing families to bank their fires or risk suffocation from smoke that couldn't escape. Morrison's fuel consumption had reached crisis levels. He was burning 3 full armloads of split oak every night, nearly a quarter cord per week, and still waking to find frost on the interior walls. His wife wrapped the children in every blanket they owned, but the open sleeping arrangements left them exposed to the convection currents that carried away their body heat as quickly as it was generated. Inside Thibodeau's cabin, the contrast was remarkable. The main room temperature had dropped to 30 degrees, cold enough that his breath formed clouds, and the water bucket developed a skin of ice. But inside the box bed, the small thermometer showed 58 degrees rising to 62 when both occupants were present. The enclosed space created its own microclimate, a pocket of warmth sustained by nothing more than human metabolism and careful engineering. The McKinnon cabin told a grimmer story. With her fuel supply nearly exhausted, Sarah had resorted to burning green wood that produced more smoke than heat. Her children developed persistent coughs from the combination of cold air and poor combustion, and she found herself choosing between keeping the fire burning or conserving the last of her split logs for the nights ahead. Dr. Henley made her rounds as best she could between storms, checking on families who might need assistance. She found a clear pattern. Households with open bedsteads were struggling to maintain habitable temperatures despite burning enormous quantities of fuel. Children in these homes showed signs of cold stress, persistent coughing, chilblains on hands and feet, and the pale complexion that came from sleeping in rooms that never warmed above freezing. The storm's third day brought no relief. If anything, the wind intensified, driving snow through gaps that had seemed adequately sealed during milder weather. Morrison had burned through 2 full cords since the storm began, and his supply was running dangerously low. The constant firing required to maintain minimal heat meant someone had to tend the stove every hour, disrupting sleep and exhausting the family's energy reserves. Thibodeau's fuel log told a different story entirely. His carefully banked fires consumed only 1 armload per night, and the box bed maintained comfortable sleeping temperatures without any additional heating. The fuel savings over just 3 days amounted to more than a full cord compared to his neighbor's consumption, a difference that could mean survival versus catastrophe for families with limited wood supplies. When the storm finally passed on March 14th, it left behind a transformed landscape and a stark lesson in thermal engineering. Drifts reached record heights across the Northeast, trapping communities for weeks and creating shortages of food and fuel. But for those who understood the principles of efficient heating, the Great Blizzard had been merely uncomfortable rather than life-threatening. The foreign Coffin had proven superior to conventional frontier wisdom when both were tested against the worst winter storm in recorded history. The morning of March 15th dawned clear and bitter cold, with temperatures hovering near zero and wind that cut through wool coats like they were cotton. Samuel Morrison emerged from his house, hollow-eyed and shaken, having burned through nearly 3 cords of oak in 4 days just to keep his family from freezing. His children had developed persistent coughs from sleeping in rooms that never warmed above 35 degrees, and his wife complained of chilblains on her hands and feet from the constant exposure to drafts around their open bedstead. Morrison's fuel consumption told a stark story of frontier heating failure. Each night had required 3 armloads of split oak to maintain minimal warmth, and even then the family had huddled under every quilt and blanket they owned. Frost had formed on the interior walls despite the roaring fire, and ice had crusted the water bucket beside their bed. The mathematics were brutal. At his current burn rate, his remaining wood supply would last perhaps another month, leaving the family vulnerable through the worst part of winter. 3 miles up the valley, Thibodeau stepped out of his cabin to assess the storm damage with the confidence of a man who had slept warm every night. His fuel consumption had been exactly what he'd calculated: 1 armload per night, carefully banked to provide steady heat without waste. The box bed had maintained its 60-degree interior temperature while the main room froze, creating a pocket of comfort that required no additional fuel beyond what was needed for cooking and daytime warmth. Dr. Margaret Henley began her post-storm rounds with growing concern for the families scattered across the township. Her medical training had taught her to recognize the signs of cold stress, and she found them everywhere. Children with persistent respiratory complaints from sleeping in frigid rooms, adults showing early signs of frostbite from inadequate nighttime heating, and elderly residents whose weakened circulation left them particularly vulnerable to the killing cold that penetrated even heated cabins. At the McKinnon homestead, the widow Sarah faced a crisis that threatened her family's survival. Her fuel supply was nearly exhausted, reduced to green wood and furniture scraps that produced more smoke than heat. Her 2 children had developed deep coughs that spoke of lungs irritated by cold air and poor combustion, and she herself showed the gray complexion of someone who hadn't slept warm in weeks. The open bedstead that frontier convention demanded had become a liability she could no longer afford. Willem van der Berg made careful notes in his journal, recording temperatures and fuel consumption with the precision of a man whose Dutch ancestors had perfected efficient heating over centuries of harsh winters. His family's traditional bedstead had performed exactly as expected, maintaining comfortable sleeping temperatures while consuming minimal fuel. The enclosed sleeping space had created a microclimate that his body heat alone could sustain, proving once again that Old World techniques often surpassed American frontier assumptions. Young Thomas Carey, a teamster and part-time carpenter who worked at Henley's sawmill, found himself calculating lumber costs with new urgency. He'd watched his fuel supply dwindle during the storm, while his open bedstead left him shivering under inadequate quilts. The tongue-and-groove pine planks he handled daily at the mill suddenly took on new significance as he realized they could be assembled into an enclosed bed that would cut his heating costs in half. The township trustee, Jeremiah Walsh, began compiling reports from families throughout the valley, documenting fuel consumption and health outcomes with the methodical approach of a man responsible for winter relief expenditures. The pattern was unmistakable. Households with traditional open bedsteads had consumed 2 to 3 times more fuel than normal, while still failing to maintain adequate sleeping temperatures. Medical complaints clustered around respiratory problems and cold-related injuries that spoke of inadequate nighttime heating. Dr. Henley's records provided clinical evidence for what Thibodeau had demonstrated through practical engineering. Children sleeping in enclosed spaces showed significantly fewer symptoms of cold stress, their lungs protected from the drafts that aggravated coughs and respiratory infections. Adults in box beds reported better sleep quality and fewer instances of waking to tend fires, suggesting that stable temperatures contributed to both physical comfort and overall health outcomes. Morrison found himself making the walk to Thibodeau's cabin with the reluctant steps of a man forced to abandon his convictions. His authority as road overseer and his reputation for practical frontier knowledge had been undermined by the simple fact that his heating methods had failed, while the foreign Coffin had succeeded. The evidence was undeniable. The Acadians' enclosed bed had outperformed every conventional approach in the valley. Thibodeau received his visitors with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman whose work had been vindicated by harsh testing. He opened his lumber notebook and began sketching retrofit options for families who couldn't build complete box beds, but needed immediate improvements to their sleeping arrangements. A half-enclosed bed built against an interior wall could capture many of the thermal benefits at reduced cost, while simple curtain systems could create air barriers around existing bedsteads. Sarah McKinnon became the first to request detailed construction plans, her desperation overriding any concerns about adopting foreign methods. Thibodeau calculated that she could build a basic enclosed bed using 80 board feet of tongue and groove pine and 30 board feet of 2x2 framing lumber, materials that would cost less than the extra fuel she'd burn in a single cold month with her current open arrangement. Thomas Carey volunteered his carpentry skills in exchange for detailed instruction in box bed construction techniques. His experience with millwork gave him the skills needed for precise panel fitting and sliding door hardware, while Thibodeau's knowledge provided the thermal engineering principles that made the difference between a simple wooden box and an effective heating system. The retrofit projects began within days of the storm's end. Carey constructed a half-enclosed bed for the McKinnon cabin, building a 3-sided box against the interior wall with sliding doors that could be closed at night and opened during the day. The immediate results were dramatic. The children's coughs began improving within a week, and Sarah reported sleeping through the night for the first time since her husband's death. Vanderberg shared his family's bedstead maintenance techniques, emphasizing the importance of weekly airing on mild days and seasonal refreshing of straw ticks to prevent moisture buildup. The Dutch tradition included specific protocols for ventilation management, adjusting the vent openings based on outside temperature and humidity to maintain optimal air quality without sacrificing thermal efficiency. By the end of March, 3 families had completed enclosed bed installations, and 2 others had ordered lumber for construction as soon as the roads cleared enough for hauling. The Coffin, that had been mocked as foreign superstition, was becoming the standard for sensible winter sleeping, its 30-degree temperature advantage impossible to ignore when fuel was precious and survival was at stake. By the following autumn, the transformation of Hudson Valley sleeping arrangements was complete enough to surprise visiting peddlers and itinerant preachers who found enclosed beds in cabins where open bedsteads had once dominated. Samuel Morrison, swallowing the last of his pride, had commissioned Thomas Carey to build a full box bed for his frame house, complete with sliding doors and spindled galleries carved in the Breton style. The road overseer, who had once warned against foreign coffins, now slept 30 degrees warmer than his main room temperature, burning half the fuel he'd consumed the previous winter. Sarah McKinnon's half-enclosed bed had proven so successful that she'd saved enough on fuel costs to commission a second unit for her children. The retrofit design Thibodeau had sketched, 3 solid walls against the cabin's interior partition, with sliding doors completing the enclosure, had cut her nighttime heating requirements by 60% while eliminating the respiratory complaints that had plagued her family through previous winters. Her children's health had improved dramatically once they were shielded from the drafts that swept across open bedsteads in single-room cabins. Thomas Carey had become the valley's expert in box bed construction, his sawmill experience translating perfectly to the precision required for tongue and groove panels and sliding door mechanisms. He developed a standardized approach that could adapt Thibodeau's design to different cabin sizes and budgets. A basic three-sided retrofit required 80 board feet of pine planking and could be completed in 2 days with hand tools. A full freestanding unit demanded 120 board feet and 3 days of careful joinery, but the fuel savings justified the investment within a single winter season. Willem van der Berg had taken on the role of technical advisor, sharing Dutch maintenance techniques that prevented the moisture problems some families had experienced with poorly ventilated enclosures. His protocols included weekly airing on mild days, seasonal replacement of straw ticks, and careful management of the adjustable vents to maintain air quality without sacrificing thermal efficiency. The bedstead tradition his family had preserved for 3 generations provided a foundation of practical knowledge that complemented Thibodeau's Acadian techniques. Dr. Margaret Henley documented the health outcomes with the systematic approach of someone whose medical training demanded empirical evidence. Her records showed a marked reduction in respiratory complaints among children sleeping in enclosed beds, fewer cases of chilblains and cold-related injuries among adults, and improved overall health outcomes for elderly residents whose circulation couldn't cope with the temperature swings of open sleeping arrangements. The enclosed beds created stable microclimates that supported better sleep quality and reduced the metabolic stress of fighting constant cold exposure. The economic impact proved equally significant. Families using box beds consistently reported fuel savings of 30 to 50% during sleeping hours, allowing them to stretch their wood supplies through longer winters or reduce the labor required for cutting and splitting. Morrison's detailed logs showed that his new enclosed bed had cut his nighttime fuel consumption from 3 armloads to 1, freeing up nearly 2 cords of oak for daytime heating and cooking needs. Jeremiah Walsh, the township trustee, recorded the broader community effects with the precision of a man responsible for winter relief expenditures. Requests for emergency fuel assistance dropped by more than half as families adopted enclosed sleeping systems, reducing the township's hardship costs while improving overall winter survival rates. His reports to the county documented not just fuel savings, but reduced medical expenses as families stayed healthier through winters that had previously brought epidemic levels of cold-related illness. By 1890, the box bed had become standard equipment in new cabin construction throughout the region. Thibodeau found himself in demand as a consultant, traveling to neighboring valleys to teach the construction techniques that had transformed his own community's winter survival strategies. His detailed notes and measured drawings had been copied dozens of times, spreading the knowledge that turned a foreign curiosity into accepted frontier practice. The technique's adoption followed predictable patterns based on practical necessity rather than cultural preference. Families with limited fuel supplies converted first, driven by immediate survival needs that overrode any concerns about foreign methods. Larger households with adequate wood reserves adopted the system more slowly, but steady fuel savings and improved comfort eventually convinced even the most conservative builders. Young families embraced the privacy benefits that had originally motivated European adoption of enclosed beds. The ability to create intimate sleeping spaces within single-room cabins provided advantages that extended beyond thermal efficiency, offering parents refuge from children and couples, respite from the social pressures of frontier communal living. The curtained interior that Duncan MacLeod had insisted upon became a standard feature, creating double barriers against both cold air and prying eyes. The cultural resistance that had initially branded the box bed as a foreign coffin gradually dissolved as practical benefits overwhelmed aesthetic objections. Neighbors who had once mocked Thibodeau's strange furniture now sought his advice on construction details and ventilation management. The same spindled galleries that had seemed like funeral decorations were recognized as sophisticated engineering solutions that balanced air quality with heat retention. Museum curators would later trace the technique's lineage through documented examples preserved in folk collections across New England and the Maritime provinces. The Musée de Bretagne in Rennes housed Lit-clos examples that matched Thibodeau's construction methods exactly, while St. Fagan's National History Museum in Wales displayed cupboard beds with identical ventilation systems and sliding door mechanisms. The Van Cortlandt House in New York preserved Dutch bedstead installations that demonstrated the same thermal principles adapted to different cultural aesthetics. The legacy extended beyond individual families to reshape frontier building practices throughout the northeastern United States. Carpenters incorporated box bed alcoves into new cabin designs, positioning them strategically to take advantage of chimney heat while maintaining the thermal isolation that made the system effective. The principles of controlled air volume and managed ventilation influenced other aspects of frontier construction, leading to tighter building envelopes and more sophisticated approaches to interior climate management. By the turn of the century, what had begun as one man's adherence to Old World traditions had become a documented improvement in American frontier living standards. The coffin that neighbors had mocked in 1888 had proven that sometimes the most practical innovation was simply the application of proven techniques to new circumstances. When firewood was scarce and winter winds were free, heating the person rather than the room remained the most sensible approach to survival, regardless of what continent had first discovered the principle.